United States will return to normalcy, and everything is going to function better than before. However, he did not meet many of the goals that he set for domestic and policy and international issues, and he could not implement many of his legislative and policy goals. The public has been not satisfied with much of his performance. We have been witnessing a very sharp drop in his approval ratings starting in August. It coincided with the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, but his performance on domestic issues played even a greater role. And from winning the highest number of votes in American history, about 82 million votes, he became one of the most unpopular presidents in recent history. Turns out that it was not just enough to be or to say just not Trump. So I'm going to spend a few minutes about his domestic crisis for a number of reasons. One is that domestic crisis influence foreign policy and international standing. And for Israel, failures and weaknesses inside America contribute to erosion in international standing, and it is inviting provocations from enemies and rivals. We have a theory in international relations that addresses exactly this point, which is known as the two-level game between domestic and foreign policies. And we have seen those weaknesses being played a role from the nuclear negotiations with Iran through the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And as of today, the United States is facing a major crisis in the Ukraine with a possible Russian military intervention. So the domestic scene is quite important. I have identified 6 major domestic crises: political polarization and legitimacy, COVID-19, especially with Omicron, the economy, immigration, climate change, and for Israel also the steep rise in anti-Semitism. I would not be able to talk about all of these crises. I've selected just a few. So first of all, Biden entered the White House in a very difficult situation of legitimacy. His legitimacy was questioned from day one, from the first hour. Then there was this January 6th attack on Congress while counting and affirming the votes. Then there was no adequate transition between Trump and Biden, and Trump himself was absent from the inauguration, from Biden's inauguration. And during the entire year, Trump and his and the Republicans have been questioning his legitimacy, and we're talking about electoral fraud. Much of his agenda, domestic agenda, has been stored on Capitol Hill, impeded by members of his own his own party, the so-called progressives, as well as the conservatives. He offered a new path to defeat the COVID-19 pandemic. He listened and followed the advice of scientists and doctors, something that Trump did not do, kept Anthony Fauci, chief medical advisor, insisted on wearing masks, social distancing and vaccinations. But then he faced lack of sufficient cooperation with Republican governors, such as those in Florida and Texas. And Omicron changed the whole picture because it seemed as if it seemed that there were records of infections and daily patients and hospitalization. And so the image was that his ability to control the pandemic didn't work well. If we move now to another major crisis, the economy one. So the American economy has been under pressure. He came up with a very ambitious infrastructure projects worth $3 billion, also known as the BBB, Build Back Better. The progressives demanded that he also allocates at least to $2.2 billion to what they called social infrastructure. And so this was the progressive idea. Then came two senators, conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin from West Virginia, who said we are going to support only $1 to maybe $1.5 billion. The whole thing is now stuck. The numbers, the economic numbers, are not as bad as we might have thought. Unemployment down from 6.3 to 3.9%, GNP up by 8%, average income rose by 6%, but then inflation went up to 7%, the highest figure since 1982, eating all those increases in income, and the national debt rose to $27 trillion. And the trade deficit went up to $800 billion. One issue that was very, very important for Biden was climate change. He changed a few things from the Trump's era. He strengthened the Environmental Protection Agency, stopped the Keystone Pipe project, returned the United States to international conferences and conventions, trying to limit the greenhouse gas emissions. But when he went to Glasgow, he could not come with the climate bill that he wanted to pass in Congress. Just before the conference, the progressives failed him this time again. If we look at his approval ratings, we find the following. First of all, his average went negative from over 53% to about 42%. This was the sharpest drop in approval rating in 1 year. The public was not that much impressed with his performance on the COVID-19 pandemic. He was evaluated negative, about 48 to 44%. In terms of the economy, the public was looking not at his achievements, but rather at his inflation score, and disapproved of his handling of the economic situation by 56 to 40%. Republicans are now saying that perhaps this is very similar to the situation during the Carter's first term, and we remember that Carter served only one term. I think this is a little bit exaggerated, but this is what is being disseminated in the United States. So, in conclusion, I want to say that not just Trump again was not enough. There were performance failures and many disappointments. Even the Democrats have been disappointed by the Biden's performance in a number of areas, going down 10 to 15 percentage points. He has been seen as too old, not eventually dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. Inflation troubled people. We will talk about foreign policy issues later, but the image was that he is perceived as weak. The United States is weak, and therefore we see the results that I've mentioned earlier. Seems that in the second year, he would be extremely busy in improving at least the perception of his performance to avoid a major defeat in the November 2022 elections. We know from theory and history that the party that controls the White House loses many seats in Congress, and if the Republicans are able to take Congress, then it's going to be much more difficult for him to pass any legislation in Congress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eytan. Before we'll move to our next speaker, I just want to point out to our audience that if you have questions to the panelists, please use the chat function and we'll try our best to accommodate your questions. Now, our next speaker is Tal Schneider. She is a political correspondent of Times of Israel. She was a former DC correspondent for Ma'ariv, a daily in Israel, political blogger, a political correspondent for Globes. She's a frequent commentator on Israeli radio and TV stations. She's a recipient of the 2015 Omets Public Courage and Integrity Award and the 2012 Google Digital Excellence in Journalism Award. Tal, please, would like to hear.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. It's really nice to be here in this very cold afternoon in Israel, but I'm sure it's not as cold as in the rest of the world. However, it is very cold here comparative to what we are used to. I think, the subject was the social polarization. And, there was an interesting event taking place in the White House on the end of August, when Prime Minister Bennett, then only 2 months into his job, entered the Oval Office and met President Biden for the first time. And at this conversation, Bennett presented this very peculiar, interesting government that we have in Israel, having people coming from so many different walks of life, from the very far liberal left to the very far right and centrist, and for the first time ever in Israel's history, an Arab party that is representing the Islamist movement, a very religious faction, but also representing a huge part of the Israel's Arab society, the 20% of the Israel's Arab society, and they became part of the government for the first time. And when Bennett sat with Biden and he presented, they met for the first time, they chat, they talk, and they talked about this very rare government that we do have here in Israel now for 7 months already. And the question was, can this government survive? But also Biden, according to account we received later as reporters who are covering Israel's prime minister, Biden also mentioned this is a very interesting social experiment. A social experiment. In what way? After 4 election cycles, after such a huge polarization, I mean, if we talk about the polarization in the American society after the 2020 election, imagine the polarization we are experiencing here in Israel after 4 election cycles, after such a rip in Israel's society. And Biden made the notion that in an era of social polarization, with the social media maybe enforcing this polarization and causing lots of arguments and enhancing all of those arguments and quarrels that we have in this era, can a government that is coming from such a polar sides of the political map, can they heal the wounds of a polarized country? Now, it's a huge question. I don't have the answer to that yet. I think in the United States, you may be experiencing the same. And when we say polarization, we mean that people from the Democratic Party and from the Republican Party are probably unable to talk with each other and unable to agree on any part, on any subject, and cannot do anything to promote reforms or bills in the Congress. And can this be expected to overcome such polarization? So we don't have a midterm exam on that. We don't know if there's a half answer to that. I mean, maybe we should wait, as historians, as researchers, maybe we should wait at least a decade before we make a call on that question. If you ask me, as of now, 7 months into this and 1 year into the American administration, I would probably say no. It doesn't feel like the country has stood behind this government, and it doesn't feel as if in the United States there is a healing process going on. By the way, the United States, in the American administration, obviously you do not have Justice Democrats sitting together with the Tea Party, right? This is only something that we have here in Israel in the parliamentary system. So I always compare what we have here as if Bernie Sanders would sit in the same cabinet, same government, together with Ted Cruz. So you don't have that. And you may have a Republican Congress coming up pretty soon in a couple of months from now, 8 to 9 months. And then you will have a split government. Could that split government can overcome any polarization and social issues? I doubt it. I think in Israel, the judgment is still out, but it doesn't feels like it at the moment. So we don't really know. And what we do know is that as the same as you have in the United States, an unpopular president, we have an unpopular prime minister here. When he was elected, there were some expectations that with the job, the polls will come around and he will get more of a public support. This notion doesn't take place. It doesn't happen. He remains unpopular. Even with this very diverse and very complicated government, I think the public is not in a mood to thank anyone. You can look at this situation in the United States and in Israel as well for unpopular leaders, also in the prism of COVID, because I think all around the world, I mean, look at Boris Johnson, look at Bolsonaro in Brazil, and in many other countries, obviously France, Holland, and so on, I think the public unrest, the public anticipations, the public troubles, personal issues over that 2 years of a pandemic are taking a toll on the leaders. So even if they're sitting in their chair after being duly elected, they are probably, it's the era of the unpopular leaders, and both Bennett and Biden probably, fit into that trend, and we don't see a way out at the moment.
Okay, Tal?
Yeah, that's for me.
Okay, thank you very much, Tal, for this comparison. And we'll move now on to Shmuel Rosner. He's a senior fellow at the Jewish People Policy Institute. He is also an analyst for Kan News TV as well as Public TV. I see you almost every night there. And he writes a weekly column for the Jewish Journal in LA and for Ma'ariv in Israel. He has written several books, 3 books on American Jews and 1 on Israeli Judaism. And he will speak to us about the rift between American Jewry and Israel.
Hello, I hope you can hear me. Thank you for having me at such a distinguished conference. And it's great to see so many friends online. I wish someday we will be able to gather together for coffee and maybe even a cake. But for now, this will suffice. I was asked to speak about the rift between American Jews and Israel. And let me start with the 22nd version. The 22nd version is, this is a topic on which we think too much and talk too much. I don't think the rift between American Jews and Israel should be or is at the top of the agenda for either community, neither for American Jews nor for Israel. This is a current, essential, dramatically urgent issue. I think because of both political interests and maybe also philanthropic interests, we tend to deal with this issue much more than it deserves. Even so, since you asked me to talk about it, I will now elaborate. So what's really on the table? I'll start with the American Jewish community and let me look at the last year, but also at the last decade or so. I would say that there are a few urgent things that American Jews must deal with today. The first of which, and this is very current since last week, is anti-Semitism, and in general, the image of Jews within the United States. I'm not sure how many of you read the article by Deborah Lipstadt at yesterday's New York Times, but she was pointing at a disturbing process, a process on which others also spoke in the past, of Europeization of the United States public arena, namely a process that leads to the inability of American Jews to live in what used to be a social haven for this community. I spent a long time, a few years, living in the United States. About a decade and a half ago, Tal and I were there at about the same time. And at that time, American Jews tended to say that, anti-Semitism is something that belongs to other communities. This is not something that American Jews are worried about. This is not an American phenomenon. America is special. It is different. What we've seen in the last decade, and even more so in the last 5 or 6 years, is an increasing tendency to see in the United States things that we used to see mostly in Europe or in places such as Turkey, synagogues turning into citadels and into places that must be guarded heavily. And this is something that will have definite impact on the American Jewish community and the American Jewish psyche. Second thing that I would emphasize is political polarization. Political polarization impacts all of American society. It also impacts the American Jewish society. The inability of different Jewish factions to speak with one another and unite and come together for certain things is becoming more and more a disruptive force within the Jewish community. We see left-wing and right-wing Jews fighting with one another. We see ultra-Orthodox and ultra-secular or ultra-Reform Jews living with one another. And for this community to come together in an atmosphere in which polarization is such a dramatic phenomenon as it is in the United States today, it is disruptive and troubling. There is COVID. We have a tendency to forget COVID, but COVID is having and will have implications on the American Jewish community, both financial and also other. COVID changes the culture of people, the culture of communities. This whole thing of doing things from a distance is going to stay with us for a long time. And we aren't sure how this will impact places such as the JCC or the synagogue or the federation, if people become used to doing things from far away from home, then synagogues might never become what they used to be, a physical center of American Jewish life. Lastly, but maybe most importantly, and I would recommend an article by Professor Jack Wertheimer, a tablet magazine from about a week ago dealing with this. The erosion of American Jewish identity in America did not start with Biden. It did not start with Donald Trump. It did not start with Barack Obama. This is an ongoing phenomenon, but it is getting more and more serious. In the last year, we got the findings of the latest Pew report on the American Jewish community, and the findings are pointing towards more erosion and more dwindling of American Jewish life. These are all things I counted: anti-Semitism, polarization, COVID, and erosion of identity. These are all things that have much more impact on the American Jewish community than the rift with Israel. Now, about the rift. There is a rift with Israel. Why there is a rift? First of all, because Israel is stronger today than what it used to be. It's more dominant. It's difficult for people who used to be at the center of the most important Jewish community in the world to get used to the idea that there is a Jewish community more thriving and possibly more dominant than their own. The two communities have cultures. If you aren't convinced, I'd recommend my book, Israeli Judaism, Portrait of a Cultural Revolution. This points to the fact that Israeli Judaism is becoming very different from American Judaism. There is an erosion of the impact of historic events such as the Holocaust, the founding of Israel, the 6 Days Wars, etc. There is the changing American landscape that makes it more difficult for some Jews to identify with a basically tribal national enterprise such as Israel. And as I already mentioned, the weakening of Jewish identity also leads to a more rift with Israel. What happened during the Biden year? We are here to discuss the first Biden year. Actually, the Biden year was probably better for the rift than previous years. All of what I just said is still true, but the last year was in many ways a calmer year for this rift because of three main reasons. The relations between the governments are better. The Biden administration and the Bennett-Lapid administration aren't having any public discourse that is raising alarm among Jews in Israel or in the United States. When relations between the governments are calmer, it's easier for American Jews not to constantly think about whether Israel is a disruptive force in their quest to be welcomed by the American society. Second reason is that the current Israeli government is less annoying for most American Jews. It is less orthodox, it is less confrontational. There's no Benjamin Netanyahu as the head of it. So it's just less annoying, less in-your-face type of government. The government is trying hard to be nice to American Jews. It didn't give them much in the sense of actual policies, but it shows a nicer, calmer, more polite face to American Jews. And last things, other issues center stage: COVID, Afghanistan, new government in Israel, Iran. All these things make the Jewish-Israel rift of much less importance. So ultimately, my message is things aren't getting better, but the last year was not the worst that we've seen. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, Shmuel. We'll move now to Owen Alterman. He's a television journalist and analyst of international affairs. Significant work in media, writing, and lectures to diverse audiences. He was educated at Harvard, Princeton, and he is working for ILTV 24, I-24. We don't hear you. Please unmute yourself.
I just did, my bad. I'm so sorry about that. Yeah, I-24 News. That's where I hang my hat. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Jerusalem Institute for the invitation, and really excited to be with everybody. Really interesting to hear what everybody else had to say. Shmuel, Rosner, so many of those things really hit home with me as somebody who grew up in the United States, as you can obviously hear, tries to keep my ear to the ground in what's going on in the community, the overriding importance of the assimilation issue still, even with all these other issues coming up. And as you rightly said, the change in the balance of power between Israel and American Jews. I think it's a huge issue that's not talked about enough. But on to the issue I'm talking about, which is the 2022 midterm congressional elections. I'm going to start by telling you guys who is going to win. Obviously, that's pretty important to know the bottom line, even this early, sitting here in January, where we don't have all of the relevant facts in hand yet. I'll tell you that. And I'll tell you where the disagreement is about why who is going to win, which is an important point to talk about. We're also going to talk about some of the things that are important in watching these elections beyond the bottom line of who's going to win, because there are going to be things that happen over the course of the next 9 months, 10 months, and over the course of that election cycle that are going to be important beyond the question of who wins. Obviously, we'll talk about what it means for Israel and what the impact of this 2022 midterm will be for us. And then actually, after talking about what it means for Israel, I want to go back at that point and talk about, if we have time, what it means for America. And I think there's a message there for us too. I'll start with who's going to win. Obviously, we'll dispense with the basics. The conventional wisdom across the board, everybody agrees the Republicans are going to have a good cycle. As Eytan Gilboa said earlier, it is an ironclad law of American politics that the party out of power, that's not in the White House, does well in midterm elections. And there's no reason to believe that this is going to be any different this year. There's every reason to believe it will be the same. Where there is a real difference of opinion is not who is going to do better, right? Who is going to gain seats and probably win the House. It'll be the Republicans. Who might be able to win the Senate, the Republicans. But the question is why. And if you look at articles in the New York Times and so on and so forth, they'll focus on structural reasons, which I'll get to in a second. But if you actually look to the professionals who rate these races, who track them on a day-to-day basis, on a granular basis, they point to more political reasons. And what I mean in terms of the difference between structural reasons and political reasons are those that are tied to public opinion itself. Who is going to vote for the candidates and why? Or which candidate are the voters going to vote for and why? Structural reasons are things about the way the election is run, the way the system is set up, that obviously also have an impact. So if you look at commentators, particularly in left-leaning outlets, they focus on structural issues. We'll talk about those in a second. If you look at the professionals, they're more focused on the bread and butter political issues. What are the political reasons why Republicans are expected to do better? Well, we heard a bunch of them. Eytan Gilboa talked about it. Professor Gilboa talked about it. Joe Biden is unpopular. That's an important indicator going into a midterm election. You ask people generically, are you going to support a Democrat or Republican for Congress? People say they're supporting Republicans. You ask about party identification. There's even a swing there, a very interesting one, towards Republicans. The economy is at best in, let's say, mixed shape. There is a pandemic still going on that could be a wild card. There are many reasons to believe that Republicans will do well if you look at things as they stand. And those are the political reasons. And if you look at professionals who focus on this, they're more focused on those, the sort of traditional bread and butter when you follow congressional races. As for the structural reasons, the reasons beyond which candidate are voters going to vote for and why, there are also those that are in the background. And again, these are a focus, again, to a lot of commentators, particularly on the left. Things like voting rights and redistricting in particular. In terms of this issue of voting rights, as many of you may know, almost 24 American states, most of the time led by Republicans, have passed laws that in one way or another restrict voting, right? You may not be able to vote absentee as easily as you could. You may not be able to drop off your ballot as easily as you could. You might be harder for you to register to vote than it was in the past. And this is thought to have a disproportionately bad impact on Democratic voters, right? Many of whom are racial minorities who tend to be poorer, and it's expected to hurt them. And again, that's one of the reasons why it's so troubling, again, to a lot of the commentators on the left. They're obviously also troubled, looking beyond 2022 at 2024, they're troubled at seeing this as part of American democracy. And it's an extremely important issue in itself. Again, if you look at the way the professionals look at these races, they're not so focused on this as a factor in the here and now in 2022. There's also the issue of redistricting. As many of you may know, every 10 years, the US conducts a census. And based on that census, the lines for the single member districts in the American system are redrawn. It's a very complicated process. It's a highly decentralized process happening in each of the 50 states. But over the course of time, it has become more and more partisan. And with Republicans often in control, more often than not, in state legislatures in the past few decades, they have been able in some states to create districts where the lines make it much easier for Republicans to take seats out of proportion to the amount of votes they actually win in the state. And coming into this cycle, there had been a fear on the part of Democrats, because those lines are being drawn, we should say, right now. There was a census in 2020. The census results only came out much later because of the pandemic. This is the first election in which new districts are going to be drawn. And many Democrats had feared that Republicans were going to do very well as part of this process. The long and the short of it is they haven't. And in the 2/3 of states that have drawn the line so far, most commentators will say it's essentially a wash, meaning that Republicans and Democrats have done, in a sense, equally well, and nobody has gained traction. There's still another 1/3 of the states to draw their lines, including places like New York and Florida that could change the picture. There are some court cases. But in any event, this is another structural factor, which is important in terms of understanding the direction of American democracy, but that maybe surprisingly and maybe counterintuitively, again, if you look at where the professionals are focused, may not have a big impact on the 2022 elections. Where again, the likelihood is that Republicans will take control of the House of Representatives. Democrats currently have a 9-seat majority, and Republicans may be able to take control of the Senate, which of course is tied 50-50 right now, with Vice President Kamala Harris casting a tie-breaking vote. There, it's actually maybe surprisingly close given the overall political winds that favor the Republicans. Real quickly, because I'm running a little bit short on time. Other things important to watch in this election. Number one, there are a lot of retirements. I'm going to get back to that in a second. A lot of legislators, particularly Democrats, are deciding not to run for re-election again. So we're expecting a high turnover of new members of Congress. The other thing that is happening as part of that redistricting process, it may not be that Republicans or Democrats are gaining ground, but what is happening is the number of districts that are safely Democratic or safely Republican, where they're not really competitive in a November election, right? Where it's easy to know who will win just by who lives in the district. The number of those safe districts has gone even further up, meaning there are even fewer competitive districts than in the past. That also has an impact on American democracy. What does it mean for Israel? Well, first of all, again, as I said, Republicans seem likely to take control of the House, maybe take control of the Senate. Will that make it have an impact on Israel? I think at the margins. Again, we still have a Democrat in the White House, so it's not as if Republicans will be able to run the gamut on legislation. Of course, in the Senate under the American system, on a lot of pieces of legislation, you need not only 50 seats or 60, but rather 60 seats. We've seen that play out a lot in the last year, so you always need to work with another party if you have a hope of getting something passed. But what does happen when the control of Congress changes is, of course, the committee chairman change. You can have hearings on certain topics and not others, investigations potentially on certain topics and not others. And it may help a bit on certain pieces of legislation, for example, funding of the Iron Dome, which might be easier if Republicans get just those few more seats and take control of the House. But I do think for Israel, the headline is actually elsewhere. And that's frankly where it's been over the course of the last number of years. And that's on the Squad and on developments within the Democratic Party. And what would have been unthinkable 20 or 30 years ago, let alone earlier, a number of lawmakers inside the House of Representatives who are unabashedly and unequivocally anti-Israel in every sense of the word. And of course, we've seen that play out. It's been headline news here in Israel, as it has been in the United States. And most of them are not going anywhere. These are household names across the United States with huge followings. In most cases, were and will be in safe districts where they're not really at risk, certainly of being beaten by a Republican, but maybe even by a Democrat. Although again, here, do watch the redistricting process. Rashida Tlaib, for example, in Michigan, where I'm from, is going to be in a district which has different lines, and there is a primary challenger against her. So we'll have to see how that particular situation develops ahead of the primary there. The other thing interesting for Israel is how the Israel issue is going to play out in the Democratic Party, even beyond that kernel of hardline anti-Israel politicians, right? The shades of support for Israel or opposition to Israel, as you would have it, those who are more aligned with J Street, more aligned with AIPAC. Here too, there's a very interesting Democratic primary in Michigan, actually the district where I vote in, where many, many Jews vote. It's going to be happening in August. I don't have time to get into it now, but it's a kind of J Street versus AIPAC proxy contest. I could talk about it more in the Q&A if people are interested. One final word about what this means for America. Beyond the question of who is going to win more seats in this election, which party is going to gain ground, as has been the case over the past number of years, everything that's going on in the United States electorally and in terms of governance shows just how deep the problems are with the US Constitution and the way it functions. This whole concept of redistricting and the fact that it can be in control of one party and that one party can use its control of the state legislature to get an advantage is extremely problematic from the perspective of how to run a republic that's a democracy. It's been going on for hundreds of years, but it's easier in the age of computer modeling. This issue of legislators taking control of elections, again, may not determine who does better in November, but extremely troubling in terms of the way democracy functions. The filibuster, which admittedly is not an issue of elections, but is also, again, makes it much, much harder to govern the United States and is another reason why we can expect further gridlock no matter what happens in November. Even the issue of states having 2 Senate seats, no matter their population. The population of California is 68 times the population of Wyoming. Each of them has 2 seats. That's a much greater distortion than it was in 1790 when the system was set up. And again, shows the real problems at the root of American democracy. And there too, I think there's a warning for us here in Israel. Every so often, people look at the Israeli Knesset, throw their hands up and says, we should have single member districts just like in the United States. Wouldn't it be better if each Israeli citizen had one member of the parliament that was his member of parliament, that was his go-to person with issues with the government, where there would be real constituent relations? Just say no. Importing this kind of system with its problems to Israel, I think would be a catastrophe for our democracy. And I think it's better to look at the positives of the proportional system, its ability to bring marginal groups into the system and give them power. Again, admittedly, sometimes disproportionate power. Obviously, it means we have a lot of elections. It means we have a prime minister who has 6 mandates, 6 seats in the parliament, and other odd results. But we do have ad hoc coalitions that come together. Tal touched on that. And even if that doesn't get at the issue of social polarization, it does help to make the country ultimately more governable, at least in the United States. So I do think in watching American politics from afar, there are lessons for us here at home.
Thank you very much, Owen. There are a few questions from the audience. 2 relates at least to the demographic situation in the United States. The growth of Hispanics, how will this affect American politics? Also, where is the Muslim population going? You have a growing number of Muslims in the United States. I wonder if any one of you would like to take upon itself to answer one or both questions.
I can say a few words about the Hispanic vote, so to speak. Obviously, the Hispanic population is the fastest growing group in American politics and society. They have not yet fully exploited their political power. This may take time because many are either not allowed to vote, are not legitimate residents of the United States, or they are, but do not necessarily think that voting would affect their daily life. There are 2 major Hispanic groups in American society. One lives in Florida, mostly of Cuban origins. They usually vote for the Republican Party. and the rest all over the country, they vote mostly Democratic. It's like 70-30% in the opposite direction. It's extremely difficult to convince Hispanics that the United States should have very close relations with Israel. I've been trying that for myself for several times. They are much more concerned about immigration, about what's happening in American relations with Latin America. The major demographic change in the American society would mean that the whites are going to lose their majority. So, and this will take 1 decade, 2 decades. In 2 decades, the minorities are going to be in the majority. Obviously, there's a big question about the kind of collaboration they would be able to accomplish. In California today, the whites are already in the minority, 38% white, 38% Hispanics. And so we are going to see much of that in the future. And the challenge for Israel, perhaps also for American Jewry, is how to connect with the Hispanic community, how to obtain from them the kind of sympathy and empathy for Israel, and how you get them to support very close relations between the United States and Israel.
Anyone wants to venture some words about the Muslim community?
I guess I'll take it. Just to add a couple things to what Eytan Gilboa just rightly said about Latinos, about Hispanics. There was an interesting situation in the 2020 election. If you look at results from the Rio Grande Valley, it's an area in Texas, right along the border with Mexico, heavily Latino, mostly Mexican American, still voted for Joe Biden by a majority, but a much smaller majority than in the past. Donald Trump in particular picked up a lot of support there, and it was closely watched. Again, everyone is watching to see if we're in the middle of a political realignment in the United States, right? With white working class voters moving towards the Republican column, as we've seen through the Trump era and now in the post-Trump era. And if we're as a kind of parallel, seeing groups like parts of the Latino sector, community, society, moving potentially also with them towards the Republicans, just again, as some suburban voters and more educated whites, college-educated whites move towards the Democrats. So there's a question about Latinos, or at least this segment of the Latino society. Again, as Eytan Gilboa rightly said, it's highly diverse, whether there is potentially some realignment there towards the Republicans to some degree. As for Muslim Americans, obviously very fast-growing population, has over the course of decades, if you look back, swung between Republicans and Democrats. People forget that in the 2000 elections, Arab Americans in Dearborn voted heavily for George W. Bush for a number of reasons, but partly because they agreed with some of the conservative religious values that the Republican Party put out. That may well be a thing of the past for all of the reasons, if you read between the lines of all the reasons we've all been saying, but certainly they're getting their voice and their feet down in politics. And again, just look at the House of Representatives. Figures like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib are really standard bearers in a way that, I mean, there have been Muslim representatives, of course, Muslim American representatives in the past, but never with the same level of outspokenness on issues that relate to the way that Muslims around the world, at least in principle in the United States, see politics, international affairs. So obviously it's something to be watching for, to seeing how it develops. Although again, in the Latino example, we see, and even if you look again, far enough back in the history of Muslim American politics, the reality is sometimes more complicated than the theory. And it may not be that Muslim politicians in the House of Representatives will always be on the left of the Democratic Party. It's something, of course, for all of us to keep watching out for.
Tal.
Yeah, just one little comment about the Muslim Americans. This is from my daily work as a bit reporter, and I'm absolutely know that for sure, because I've heard that from, let's say, a senior administration official, is for the visa waiver program that is highly anticipated in Israel. I may say maybe it's the most anticipated process that can ever happen here. People are looking forward to be able to go into the United States without the need to go through the American bureaucracy. But in order to get there, there is one condition that is not yet fully debated, I suppose. And this is a demand by the administration for
reciprocity.
Reciprocity, thank you. Specifically, letting Muslims American and Muslim American who live in the West Bank and Muslims American who live in the United States go back and forth. Israel needs to improve its results on any obstacles that it may put on American Muslims in the West Bank or Muslims American in the United States trying to go back and forth from the West Bank or from Israel to the United States and vice versa. And that obviously reminds us one of the most, the event when Israel's authorities, the Minister of Interior, blocked the entry of Rashida Tlaib to the country, to Israel, to the West Bank. So that was, that took place, if you don't remember, when Netanyahu was the prime minister and Trump was the president. Now we have a different government here and different administrations out there. And these current administrations probably wants to make sure those things don't happen, not only for elected officials, but also for Muslims Americans. So that is very interesting to my opinion. And other than that, I think the Muslim community of the United States is a very, very tiny community. Am I wrong? I'm not sure about the numbers, but obviously they have elected representative, but it is, the numbers are very low. So I would not be, as an Israeli, I would not be overly worried about their political influence in the United States. I think it's in the sidelines, really, except for the strong vocal discourse that they're making through the Democratic Party. But other than that, it doesn't feel as if they have huge influence.
One Israeli is bewildered at the fact that immigrants can come into the United States illegally and vote. If it's true, can you explain that, without having citizenship? Anybody?
For American citizens voting where?
People that come from abroad to the United States as illegal immigrants without acquiring citizenship, and they can vote. That's what people hear.
Maybe they can vote for dog catcher, which is the lowest elected position in America. Because in local elections are very different from federal elections, but I'm not aware of new immigrants voting in national elections.
Somebody remarked here that they go through through mail ballots.
I don't. Yeah, I don't think that's. I mean, the only way in which, of course, it is true is over the course of decades, right? Of course, there's a very contentious issue in the United States. There have been waves of illegal immigrants who've later gotten amnesty, gotten the famous path to citizenship. And of course, once you are naturalized and given citizenship, of course, at that point, you get to be able to vote, even if originally came into the country illegally.
There are just to say, factually, there are few states, I remember specifically New York, in which immigrants, even illegal immigrants, are allowed to vote for certain positions. But this is not an issue in federal elections, neither for Congress nor for president.
What is the future of the AIPAC J Street struggle, Shmuel?
What is the future of the, well, look, AIPAC and J Street are not parallel, neither in
will you explain why they stand for, what they stand for?
Look, AIPAC is a traditional Jewish American organization that attempts to walk a very fine line in very difficult times. I already spoke about the polarized American political scene. For AIPAC to still keep its stance as a bipartisan organization in times in which bipartisanship is almost nowhere to be found, is a very difficult task. So AIPAC is trying just to survive these times, to be able to move to the other side of these dark times without getting hurt, while J Street is riding the wave of polarized time, and it's trying to make waves within the American Jewish community, especially among young progressive American Jews. In my view, the split of the American Jewish voice, communal voice, is not helpful neither for the Jewish community nor for Israel. It's better for all Jews in the United States and in Israel that Jews have a unified, that they speak in one voice. But ultimately, this cannot happen at such times. And that's why we see AIPAC struggling in some ways and J Street making a lot of noise. Again, I don't think J Street is as strong as the loud noise make it seem, but it does have followers in the Democratic Party, and it legitimizes voices that we weren't used to hear within the Democratic Party. People, voters and elected officials within the Democratic Party can say things about Israel today that they could not say a decade or 2 decades ago, because they can say them and still rely or still say that they have the support of a so-called pro-Israel organization. So that's the impact of J Street. Again, my personal view, it's not great for Israel, but you know, both Israel and the American Jewish community will have to learn to live with this, because I don't think it's going away. I think polarization among Jews in America is also here to stay, and this polarization reflects itself in the split between AIPAC and J Street supporters.
Anybody wants to say something about this? What is the effect of a conservative Supreme Court on the ability of Biden to govern? That's a question.
We have just seen it in a decision made by the Supreme Court to disapprove of Biden's plan to force companies and public organizations to force either vaccinations or routine frequent checking on COVID-19. The balance of power right now at the Supreme Court is 6 conservatives versus 3 liberals, so to speak. The Democrats have threatened to increase the number of judges. The Constitution does not say anything about the number of Supreme Court judges, and in the past there were other numbers. Today, given the balance of power between Democrats and Republicans in Congress, and the likelihood of the Republicans to win at least one of the branches of Congress, it seems unlikely to happen. The Congress, I think I mentioned that earlier, Biden had problems inside his own party. He could not get the progressives and the conservatives to agree on significant pieces of legislation, especially economic legislation. So you have, first of all, this constraint, the legislative constraint, and this is not going to be resolved in any way, if not the other way around, at the Supreme Court.
Let me, I'd like to use this remark on the Supreme Court to remind us all something that I think is important. You know, it's somewhat easy for us to sit here and say that this was a highly disappointing year for President Biden, that he set the bar in such a way that he could never fulfill all the promises that he made. and it's all true, but I think it's important to remember that Biden walked into the White House under very difficult circumstances, not all of which are his fault. The Supreme Court situation is something that he inherited from the previous administration. COVID is something that obviously Biden could not be blamed for. There are many inherent issues that make life difficult for the current president. And for us to say, well, Biden is a disappointment because COVID is still with us, or Biden is a disappointment because the Supreme Court would not approve of his actions, these aren't things that he could resolve. And I think that, it was a disappointing year, but it was also a very difficult year, and it could have been much worse. It's not as bad as we tend to think. There are many things that Biden did that worked quite nicely for the economy, for unemployment and other things. And we should also remark and remind the audience of these things. Biden was not all disappointment, but also tried under difficult circumstances to do his best.
I also want to mention one other thing about the Supreme Court. It's extremely important looking ahead to this year and actually those midterm elections I talked about. Of course, the issue of abortion. This Supreme Court, as Eytan Gilboa mentioned, has the majority, or implied, has the majority to overturn the Roe v. Wade decision that enshrines the right of to have an abortion as part of the US Constitution. They have a case that they took and heard oral argument on. The decision's expected in June, potentially. And this could be a kind of meteor dropped into the middle of American politics, right? The court would not outlaw abortion in the United States. So that's not what the court would do. What it would say is you don't have a right to abortion. So if a state legislature wants to pass a law saying abortion is not allowed in our state, there's nothing to stop that state legislature from doing this. Abortion everywhere in the world is an emotional issue, no less so in the United States. And it's something that could easily shake up American society and have an unpredictable effect also on the November election.
I have two questions that basically coalesce into one. What are the main motives of discord, in American society now? And can we see America going back to pragmatic politics, particularly when Biden is probably a symbol of pragmatic politics? Anyone wants to address it?
As going back to pragmatic politics, that's an ideal, I would think, but it's not in the cards as we've seen that. I mean, when you see what's going on around the world, you don't see that approach being embraced anywhere.
We have it in Israel at times.
So, right, but as I said, 7 months into the government, you don't really feel that the Israeli public is being more pragmatic or more welcoming of any different opinion than person's own opinion. It feels as if the polarization continue very high. And so, you probably need more than just 1 year of a pragmatic politician as Biden to have an effect. And in Israel, you probably need, I don't know, maybe much more years than this, strange government to see an effect. The politics of being moderate hasn't taken place anywhere around the world that we see. I mean, again, I'm going to Brazil, or if you look at Hungary and you look at the Republican Czech Republic, it's not. It's very hard to fulfill such a promise. And the Democratic Party is also reacting in a strong way to its leaders. So you have groups that are, they're not looking into moderation. Again, I think the same goes with the Republican Party. You don't really see huge forces of moderates. In Israel, if you look at Benny Gantz, he won, I think, 8 seats in the Knesset. He is the representative of moderate, a person who can go both ways, by the way. if you look at Mansour Abbas, the leader of the Islamist movement in Israel, is a very moderate person, but he's having problem with his own people. They don't want to see moderation. They want to see a more forceful, combative leader. So, it's a problem.
I think that the United States is basically a conservative country. The progressives have been able to increase their power in Congress. And if we look at the more distant future, this could be a challenge for Israel, because young people in America, as well as in other places, are more idealistic. And they tend to favor the socialist, so to speak, part of the progressives platform. So when young people vote in presidential and congressional elections, say 10 years from now, we may see more power, more representation for the progressives. However, just during the last year, the progressives inside the Democratic Party were defeated twice. One at the city of Buffalo, and the second place was West Virginia. They lost the governorship there. And so, and polarization plays a role here, because if you look at the last 20 years, you see a back and forth stimulus and response. So if you look at the Republicans and the Tea Party group, then you see progressives, and now we may see the pendulum goes in the other direction. So I think in the present situation, it is still balanced, but I think in the future, given trends in the attitudes and opinions of young people, progressives have a better chance to grow in political power.
Don't young people grow up?
Yes, this is also a possibility that when you marry and you have kids, you change a little bit your opinion and you become conservative. The question is going to be how long it will take for people to grow up. We see in Europe, we see people at the age of 40 still live with their parents. They don't marry, they don't have kids. So I think we might see longer periods of getting more mature.
Anybody wants to address the pragmatic side of American society?
I guess I'll just add this. I mean, one reason to be pessimistic about all this is the issue of race, right? On one hand, it's more complicated, as I was talking about with those Latinos, right? Who in some proportion in that part of Texas moved more towards Donald Trump. And of course, plenty of white voters, more educated white voters who have moved toward the Democrats. So it's more complicated, but still there's a huge racial element in what's going on in American politics now. By the way, always, right? If you look back, even in the widest view of American politics, look in the book, How Democracies Die, but on the shelves somewhere, they talk a lot about the race as an organizing principle of American politics. So I think given the changing racial demographics that Eytan Gilboa talked about, that's a reason to be pessimistic. I also personally think that the constitutional problems of American democracy also are a reason to be pessimistic. Maybe those also encourage more polarization and less pragmatism, although there maybe you could argue actually the opposite. But I think there are more reasons, unfortunately, to be pessimistic than optimistic.
The last question, what is the role of the media and social media in the polarization process going on in the United States?
Negative.
Can you elaborate? You are part of the media, Shmuel.
Well, no, you're asking about social media. Yeah. We can also talk about the media, but social media is certainly, a story much larger than the current situation in America. We see social media causing polarization in many different countries, as Tal mentioned earlier. The trajectory towards more polarization in almost all countries, including Israel, by the way, is certainly affected by the increase in use of social media the emphasis of social media on people who tend to be aggressive in tone and provocative in tone, and to sharpen their pen and try to look for the more extreme views. Social media, we used to think, or we hoped, that social media will be good for democracy, as it creates a much more democratic, versatile, and lively public sphere. What happened in reality is that social media became a vehicle for creating animosities between people and between groups, and becoming more and more disruptive in the lives of large democracies. The only places in which social media does not create problems are the places in which social media is censored by the governments. In all other places, social media is harmful and it's disruptive. And I think we are just at the beginning of a process at the end of which there will have to be some kind of resolution of this issue, and both societies and governments will have to come together and figure out a better way to handle social media than what we currently see on our laptops.
Any about the regular media? The TV?
That's what I wanted to talk about. When you talk about polarization in the United States, you don't have to go to the social media. The traditional media is helping you do the work. You know, Efraim, Inbar, you mentioned at the top that you watch Shmuel Rosner on the evening news almost every night. And in Israel, and those outside of Israel joining us might be surprised to hear, there's still a culture of an evening newscast, right? At 8 o'clock at night, people turn on their television, they get your pushes on your phone maybe. You turn on your television and you watch one of the 3 channels and their evening newscast, and you get your news from something that is broadcast to the wide public, right? Left and right as one. That doesn't really exist in the United States. That's the Walter Cronkite era, the Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings, Dan Rather era in the 1980s when I was a kid. It doesn't exist today. Now you have Fox News, you have MSNBC, and even CNN, which kind of held out as a kind of avatar or a kind of paragon of centrism, got sucked in the Trump era and went in one direction, right? And made its name as being an anti-Trump station to a large degree. And the traditional media are helping do the work. At the same time, in the United States, maybe more so than most parts of the world, local media organizations are being gutted. So there's not the same kind of local media anymore. That also was a kind of thing that brought the community together. And there are still some elite media that do excellent work, but they, in some cases, are not trusted as much as they used to be, but in some parts of the public. So the traditional media has done a lot to help bring about this polarization. I don't know if it's an effect or a cause, but it's part and parcel of the project, even before you get to all the issues with social media that Shmuel Rosner rightly brought up.
Thank you very much to all of you, Tal, Owen, Shmuel, and Eytan.
Thank you for having me.
And now I'll transfer the gavel to Eytan to chair the next session about international developments. And I hope we learned something about American society for the past 1 hour and 15 minutes. Eytan.
Okay, I'm receiving the virtual gavel. First of all, obviously, Israel depends on the United States primarily for security and diplomacy. Security is obvious. Diplomacy is less, but Israel is going to face during the near future many issues. The United Nations Human Rights Council and the International Criminal Court. There, Israel depends on the United States to a large extent. In this second panel, we will discuss international and regional issues. Panelists include a distinguished professor from the United States, 2 former high-ranking military officials with experience in national security, and a journalist and a senior journalist. All speakers, please keep the 10-minute time limit. You will have an opportunity to expand on your thoughts during the Q&A session, which was very lively in the previous session. Those in the audience who want to ask a question, please use the chat and be brief. The first speaker is Professor Michael Mendelbaum, a longtime colleague and friend, classmate of mine from Harvard University. He is a Christian Herter Professor Emeritus of American Foreign Policy at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. He published no less than 17 books, most recently, The Rise and Fall of Peace on Earth, 2019, and The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy, Weak Power, Great Power, Superpower, Hyperpower, that is going to be published this year. This book should be very interesting for us. His topic is, can the United States meet its international responsibilities? Michael, please.
Thank you, Eytan. Good to see you, if only virtually. And thanks to Efraim for organizing this session and for inviting me to speak. My subject is, will America fulfill its international responsibilities? And it's divided into three parts. First, I address the question of just what those responsibilities are. Second, I will give reasons for skepticism that the United States can and will fulfill them. And then third, I will give reasons to suspect that the United States may well, in fact, fulfill them. So first, what are America's international responsibilities? They involve acting as the political and military mainstay of regional coalitions with the purpose of resisting the aggressive designs of three countries: Russia in Europe, China in East Asia, and Iran in the Middle East. The tactics and policies appropriate for carrying out these responsibilities will, of course, vary from region to region and from situation to situation, but they have a common denominator. All require the political will in the United States to play this role. Will the United States muster this political will? Well, there are reasons for skepticism. For one thing, the United States, American public, is not committed in its own mind to this particular role. One way of describing this role, and not inaccurately, is that the United States serves as a kind of global policeman. And when Americans are asked in polls whether they think their country ought to be the global policeman, by wide margins, they say no. Now, of course, it's true that the United States has played precisely this role since the 1940s. Public opinion about global policing to the contrary notwithstanding, but the circumstances in which the United States played this role in the past differ from those of the present. At the outset of the Cold War, the existence of the Soviet Union and the memory of World War II underpinned this role. Americans believed that World War II came about in part because the democracies had failed to stand up to Germany in the 1930s. They were determined not to repeat the mistake, hence the basic Cold War commitments, which were designed to prevent another war. When the Cold War ended, those commitments continued, partly because of inertia, and partly because it was cheap and easy to fulfill them. The United States faced no major threat. Now it does. Moreover, Americans in general are disappointed with the results of the country's two most recent armed conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and are leery of repeating those experiences. Now, it's true that fulfilling America's international responsibilities does not involve open-ended nation building of the kind in which the United States engaged in Iraq and Afghanistan that proved frustrating and ultimately unsuccessful. But that point is not, I think, widely appreciated in the American public. Moreover, even if Americans were to be, or indeed are, committed to fulfilling these international responsibilities, three difficulties arise. First, those responsibilities span three different parts of the world, three different theaters. In each of them, the United States faces threats and faces them more or less simultaneously. So there is the danger of what we might call threat overload. Second, the three aggressive powers have been, and presumably will continue to be, clever about using so-called salami tactics. That is, taking initiatives that tilt the balance of power in their favor, but not so dramatically that the United States and its allies respond forcefully. The third difficulty is that America's three alliance groupings, like all alliances, have weaknesses, although they're different weaknesses. In Europe, the European allies devote very little in the way of resources to defense. And the American alliance system, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is geographically far flung, so that countries far from Russia have very little interest in confronting it. In East Asia, all of the non-Chinese countries are eager for the United States to confront China, but they don't want to join the United States on the front lines for fear of jeopardizing their very lucrative trade with the Chinese. In the Middle East, America's allies, with, of course, one conspicuous exception, have negligible military capabilities. Indeed, of all American allies, I think it's fair to say that Israel is the only one that pulls its own weight, and certainly the only one that does not expect American forces to defend it. Another reason for skepticism about the fulfillment of these responsibilities involves domestic politics. As we've heard, they are deeply divided, and it's hard to get consensus for anything in the United States, including foreign policy. Moreover, neither political party is particularly well positioned politically to carry out America's international responsibilities. Democrats tend to be uncomfortable with the use of force, but the credible threat to use force is necessary for deterrence, which is central to America's global responsibilities. Moreover, there's a special difficulty with the United States and the Democratic Party when it comes to Iran. The Biden foreign policy team is almost unanimously alumni of the Obama administration. And for the Obama administration, the Iran deal, the JCPOA, was its proudest achievement, which the Biden administration is seeking to restore. As for the Republicans, they still operate under the spell of Donald Trump, who's made clear his dislike of any and all international commitments, and who displayed in office a sneaking affection for Russia's and Chinese leaders. Well, what I've said so far makes it sound as if the answer to the question, will the United States fulfill its international responsibilities, is a resounding no. But the matter is not so simple, I think. There are reasons to believe the contrary, and I now turn to them. First, the military forces necessary to carry out these commitments already exist. They're in place, they're on patrol. They may need augmenting, but no full-scale American rearmament is needed. Second, America has long-standing formal, legal, as well as informal political commitments. And being a law-minded country, the United States and its public tends to take seriously such commitments. Third, the American foreign policy establishment, the so-called political class, believes strongly in the importance of American global leadership, although members of the foreign policy establishment often define the specific requirements for leadership differently. There is a final reason to be skeptical of predictions that the United States will abdicate its global responsibilities. This reason stems from American history, and it's the theme of my forthcoming History of American Foreign Policy, The Four Ages of American Foreign Policy. It is that the American public has a history of responding forcefully to incidents that it regards as threatening. The skirmishes in Lexington and Concord in 1775 touched off the Revolutionary War. The firing on Fort Sumter in South Carolina in 1861 began the Civil War. The sinking of the battleship Maine in Havana Harbor touched off the Spanish-American War. The sinking of the liner, the Lusitania, turned America against Germany in World War I. And then, of course, there was Pearl Harbor in 1941 and World War II. And in the Cold War, we saw a particular version of this syndrome. America's adversaries took initiatives mistakenly believing that the United States would do nothing to counter them, initiatives that evoked a forceful American response. Stalin and Kim Il-sung certainly didn't expect the United States to intervene militarily in Korea in 1950. Nikita Khrushchev did not anticipate the forceful American response to his emplacement of nuclear-capable missiles in Cuba in 1962. The Soviet Politburo did not dream of the American response to its occupation of Afghanistan in 1979. And of course, Saddam completely miscalculated the American response to his seizure of Kuwait in 1990. It's not just that the aggressive power, the aggressor leader in each case, did not predict what the United States would do. Before the event, Americans themselves did not and could not predict their own response. It came as a surprise even to them, but the world suddenly looked different and Americans responded in an unexpected way. So the bottom line is this. In the Revolutionary War period, there was a popular flag, a yellow background with a green coiled snake that said, "Don't tread on me." When Americans have felt trodden on historically, they have demonstrated the capacity to respond forcefully. I suspect that this is as true in the 21st century as it was in the 18th. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mendelbaum, for your illuminating lecture. We in Israel, or many in Israel, think that we are at the center of world politics. If you read the New York Times and watch CNN too much, you may think this is true because of the kind of coverage Israel receives in the world media. But obviously, American policy in the Middle East, and more particularly, American-Israeli relations are being influenced by the way the United States formulates its global mission, its goals, its capabilities, and its determination to achieve these goals. So I think you provided us with much food for thought about those major issues. Obviously, the Iran nuclear program, or the race for nuclear bombs, has been a major issue in American-Israeli relations going back perhaps to the beginning of the decade, and more significantly so from 2013, when the United States began secret negotiations with Iran that eventually led to the signing of the 2015 nuclear deal between the Obama administration, between Obama, the European powers, China, Russia, and in Iran. So I'd like to invite now Major General retired Yaacov Amidror to speak about the Iran challenge. General Amidror is currently the Anne and Greg Rosshandler Senior Fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. He was National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu and Chairman of the National Security Council from Israeli National Security Council from April 2011 to November 2013. He served for 36 years in senior Israel Defense Forces posts including commander of the military colleges and military secretary to the Ministry of Defense. He is the author of 3 books on intelligence and military strategy, and he will speak, as we said earlier, about the Iran challenge. General Amidror, please. Amidror, where are you?
Thank you, Professor Gilboa. It is a pleasure to take part in such a meeting and to learn from those who are speaking before me and after me. I want to focus on the Iranian issue, but I want to begin with the changes in the Middle East. In one side, you can see the results of the Abraham Accord, flourishing relations between the State of Israel and Arab countries that in the past we could only dream about such relations, or to go there by night that no one will identify when we landed and when we are taking off. On the other side, we see that the Iranians are not hesitating to act against this new kind of harmony in the Middle East. This week, attack on the on the Emirates' interest, the collapsing of the Lebanese system, the continuous efforts to build the independent Iranian military capability in Syria, and the opposition and unacceptable results of the elections in Iraq from the Iranians' point of view. And what you can see that the Iranians are very active all around the Middle East. And this is, people are asking, what are you afraid from the nuclear Iran project? Will they use it against Israel? The question is, if they will have the opportunity, they will. But before that, it will give them the umbrella under which they can really promoting their aggressiveness in the Middle East. It's bad for Israel, it's bad for the Middle East, it's bad for the world. But it's clear that under such an umbrella, no one will be able to stop them in their aggressiveness. And if you want to learn the lesson, go look what happened now with North Korea. The problem is that from the Israeli point of view, it's a question of existence. We cannot allow the Iranians to have nuclear capability, not because they are promising that they want to destroy Israel, and we believe them, and not because we are not ready to live in a Middle East in which they will have such an umbrella, a Middle East in which it will not only the Iranians, but because Iranian military and nuclear capability, we will see the race for the bomb in another at least 3 countries. It's Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey. It's not my assessment. They said that will happen the day that the Iranians will have this capability. So all the 3 reasons together, the need of Israel in Israel to defend its existence, the need in Israel not to let the Iranians to build this umbrella under which they can be more aggressive, and the understanding that the Middle East might be turned into a horrible place with the 4 countries with nuclear capability, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. It is a nightmare for every Israeli thinker. So from all these 3 dimensions, we came to the conclusion that we will not let the Iranians to have nuclear military capability. The problem dealing with America relating to those issues is, first, after the last experience with the President Obama, we cannot be sure that the Americans are telling us the truth. They cheated us then, and who knows what will be the decision in the future. The feeling among those who are with the meetings with the Americans of the present administration, that this administration is more open towards Israel and less intent to lie and to cheat. But remember, that was our feeling before we had been cheated by the Obama administration. Second is that for us, it's about our existence. For the Americans, it's another problem. and for sure the Chinese challenge is much more important to the United States of America, and today even the Russian challenge is more important. So if the Americans have to prioritize their efforts, Iran might be number 6 after coronavirus, domestic issues, which was so interesting to hear the point of view from this angle. And afterwards, it's China, Russia, and only then Iran. So the fact that for us it's first priority and for American it is 6 or 7 is the first problematic issue when we deal with the Americans about Iran. Second is when you are in Washington, you don't see the clear crystal way that we are looking at the Iranians when it is very close. The Iranians are 200 kilometers from Tel Aviv in the Golan Heights and in Syria, in Lebanon. They use the Houthis, and who knows tomorrow as well as against Israel. And the Iranian nuclear issue is for us, as I said, is a huge problem. Totally different point of view from Washington, and it's well understood. It's where you stand. It's what you see, and because the different point of views, one side of the Atlantic and the other side of the Atlantic, we understand why there are gaps between us and the Americans, even if the Americans really want to share with us and want to be sure that we are on the same page. It's not the same book. We might be on the same page, but not on the same book. And this is the two main problems between us and the United States of America, the understanding of many Israelis that last time we had been cheated by the administration, and we don't want to face this situation again. And the second one is the natural two different point of views that cannot be shared by decision makers, that one of them is sitting in Jerusalem and one of them is sitting in Washington. The third, or the least one, which is maybe professionally more problematic, is our judgment that the agreement that is so important for the Americans to renew was a very bad agreement. It was a very bad agreement. It legitimized the Iranian dream for having the ability to enrich uranium. It gave the Iranians an umbrella under which they can continue to prepare their more modernized centrifuges, the next generation that they might use today. And it didn't touch the issue of the missiles and the ability to deliver the weapon. So, and the truth is that even it was mentioned in the agreement itself, the whole issue of weaponization was very, very diluted by the language. And there are more than rumors that there was a secret agreement between the Americans and the Russians that no one will ask questions about that, because it was understood that the Iranians are hiding many secrets and not telling the truth about the previous attempt to build their nuclear ability. And if someone was a little bit skeptic about it, we brought the Iranian archive from Tehran, and it is clear from the archive that the Iranians were far ahead of what was known in the West. They had a clear plan to begin with stage 1, 5 nuclear bombs, and to continue afterwards, and they were very active in the weaponization side, although it was denied the whole way before the agreement, during the agreement, and after the agreement. So if you take all these elements together, you understand how the challenge is so big and why it is almost impossible to agree about the complexity of the situation when the Americans wants to renew the agreement, and we believe that it is a bad agreement. It is something which is even worse than the agreement, is that to go to an interim agreement in which most of the sanctions will be open and the Iranians will get a lot of money, and at the end of the day, it will be even less than the agreement of 2015. This is why you hear in Israel, not just the previous administration, but the present one, the prime minister, and the next prime minister, Mr. Lapid, saying clear and open that any agreement is not, we're not obliged to take upon ourselves, and we are not part of the deal. And it is now even exposed by the media that Israel decided to take a special budget to enhance its capability to attack in Iran. And this is the policy of the state of Israel in the previous administration, in the present administration, and probably the next administration. And it is totally different from the point of view of the Americans, who believe that the agreement of 2015 is not, as was described by Susan Rice, it's the best that could be achieved. She didn't say it's a good agreement, but the best that could be achieved. And it's better than to put sanctions on the Iranians and to use military force to destroy their facilities. The point of view of Israel is totally different, and we understand that this is a gap between us and the point of view of the United States of America, and we have to live with this gap to make our friends in America to better understand the situation, to give them all the information which is needed, that they will have a bright picture of the Iranians' attempt to build this military and nuclear capability, but at the same time to keep the freedom of Israel to react when it would be needed. We don't have any timetable. The rule is very clear. The day before it will be too late, we will have to decide if we are acting or not.
Okay, thank you very much, General Amidror. Obviously, these days, the powers are negotiating in Vienna. The United States went a long way from the starting position of a stronger and a longer agreement. Once those indirect negotiations in Vienna started, the administration said it would be satisfied with just going back to the 2015 agreement. And now they are talking about less and less. And of course, the question is going to be if that less and less would not really threaten Israel's vital national security interests, and we can go into that later on. The next speaker is Colonel Reserve Dr. Eran Lerman, who is Vice President of JISS, and he also lectures at the Shalem College and Tel Aviv University. Lerman was Deputy Director of Foreign Policy and International Affairs at the National Security Council. He held senior posts at the Israeli Defense Forces military intelligence for over 20 years. He also served for 8 years as director of the Israel and Middle East Office of the American Jewish Committee in Jerusalem, here in Jerusalem. He holds a PhD from the London School of Economics. His topic is American Eastern Mediterranean Policy. Dr. Lerman, please.
Eytan, thank you very much. I'm glad that we do put the Mediterranean on our agenda nowadays, because I increasingly look at Israel's position in the world, let's say, as much in terms of our Eastern Mediterranean position as in terms of our place in the Middle East, being an old British term adopted strangely by America. Of course, the Near East or the Middle East for the United States are somewhere in between Bermuda and Portugal. We are in the Middle East because we are halfway to what used to be called the Far East. Try to tell the Chinese nowadays that they are far from anything. The term, I think, needs some rethinking, but also our position, strategically speaking, is increasingly linked not only to our immediate Arabic-speaking environment and the Iranian threat that General Amidror spoke to, but also our position vis-a-vis Turkey and our increasing, I would not say alliance, but alignment with Greece, Cyprus, and actually Egypt, with the United Arab Emirates for reasons of both strategy and ideology, acting as a supporting anchor to the East, and France for reasons of ideology, but mostly of strategic interest, acting as an anchor to the West. And the question is, what is the American position towards this emerging new reality? And against the background of a whole slew of issues on which we have growing disagreements or potential disagreements with the administration, here's a point in which the choices made by the Biden administration so far are very much in line with Israeli interests as well. And in fact, perhaps could lead to the consolidation of this alignment with an American role. And I know that there's a question hanging over the recent decision by the United States to announce its doubts about the feasibility of the pipeline, which was one of the linchpins of this alignment. But I'll come back to it. I think that this can be actually explained in much more practical rather than strategic terms. But let me first of all note that as the Biden administration decided to, and this was very much in evidence already in the interim national security guidance document in March last year, to base their key strategy looking at Russia, China, and Iran, to echo what Professor Mandelbaum has been telling us. It did so on the basis of building back, to use a phrase which is central to the Biden concept, building back the notion of what we once upon a time very daringly called the free world, the community of democracies. And that was symbolized in December by the virtual Summit for Democracy, in which Israel participated. Interestingly enough, only one Arab country, Iraq under Kazemi. This was basically a pat on the back for a government which is struggling to free itself from the Iranian stranglehold. But in terms of the Eastern Mediterranean, the significant aspect of this summit was the decision not to invite Erdogan's government to participate. Now, Turkey is a democracy of sorts. It has parties, it has elections. It will have a presidential election 2 years from now, next year actually. And nevertheless, the manner in which Erdogan exercises his power as the elected president of Turkey and the conduct of Turkey on a whole range of issues within its borders and beyond its borders have led to this very momentous decision, symbolic, but very significant, to signal a deep sense of displeasure with Turkish policy and with Turkish governance. And this adds to, or has been added to, a whole other set of indications. Trump, as president, had a certain sense of sympathy or affinity towards Erdogan in person, although from time to time he, of course, let his temper fly at specific Turkish actions, such the arrest of Pastor Bronson. But and there were people in key positions in the Trump administration who looked at regional issues, including Syria, from a fairly pro-Turkish point of view, if I may put it that way. This is no longer the case. The administration is clearly positioning itself in support of the alignment greatly increasing military cooperation with both Greece and by the way, with Israel at the same time. And this is, we didn't speak so much to this until now, but I should mention in passing, this is not my subject, but I should mention in passing that the level of military cooperation, joint exercises in the Mediterranean, Noble Dinah, Nemesis, and others involving the Greeks, Cypriots, and Israelis, but also in the Gulf and in Israeli airspace, like the recent Desert Falcon exercise, or the previous and the American participation in the Blue Flag biannual exercise in Israel. This is an intensified dimension of Israeli-American relations, I think at unprecedented levels. You can think of it perhaps in the context of what we've heard from General Amidror as perhaps a bear hug designed to calm our unsteady nerves and assure us of American support, but it is nevertheless in and of itself generating a sense of affinity, a sense in the US military establishment that Israel is of value. And all of this is reflected in the Gulf, but also in the Eastern Mediterranean. Which brings me to the question, the economic question. Why did the US openly state that it no longer believes in the feasibility of the East Med pipeline? Well, I've seen various strategic interpretations. They still want to keep Erdogan happy, that they don't want to add another point of contention to the already loaded relationship with the Russians. But I would say simply that they, to the best of my understanding, practically every economist who ever looked at this, they had the same judgment, namely that it is not economically viable. It will not pay for itself. And it would be a better idea, and the US immediately mentioned this in the context of this, what they call the 3+1 strategy, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and the US, that to build a power station based on Eastern Mediterranean gas, Israeli, Greek, Israeli, Cypriot, and Egyptian, and lay a power cable, a much less problematic proposition technically and financially, and also something that could be used in the future to relay energy from other sources, for example, solar or whatever else will come down the road, from the Eastern Mediterranean countries to Europe. That may be a better idea in many ways. So I would not offer a negative interpretation to this decision. What all of this means in the region is that the Biden administration had to walk back, and this is quite notable, from its original criticism of Sisi's regime in Egypt. You may recall that Biden was somewhat unpleasantly disposed towards Trump's description of Sisi as his favorite dictator. Today, we see less friction, more cooperation with the Egyptian government being what it is and as it is. And this in itself, this also chimes very well with Israel's interest in Egyptian stability. And one last point, circling back to our discussion in the previous panel on domestic issues, this opens for Israel and Israel's friends in America a range of new options in terms of cooperation with the fairly powerful and well-established Hellenic community, Greek and Cypriot, Americans of Greek and Cypriot origins, who have already created quite intimate relationship with some of the representative organizations of American Jewry. I can attest to this from my days at AJC. And by now, this is not just a warm and fuzzy talk, but it is linked to the emergence of a significant strategic alignment. And I'll rest here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alterman, for this interesting dimension of critical developments in the region. Our last speaker for today is Lahab Kharkov. She is a senior contributing editor and diplomatic correspondent at the Jerusalem Post. She was the Post's top analyst and reporter in the Knesset for over 8 years, and former news editor and managing editor of the JerusalemPost.com. Lahab is an expert on Israel's domestic and international politics. She grew up in New Jersey and moved to Israel at the age of 17. She has a degree in political science and communication from Bar-Ilan University. She will speak on the United States and the Israeli-Palestinian arena. Lahab, please.
Thank you, Professor Gilboa. So the Israel and US sort of relationship, the back and forth when it comes to the Palestinian issue, has a lot to do with the unique situation in Israeli politics right now. So I want to begin with that a little bit. So this government, as many of you are probably familiar, is a unity government which has political parties from across the political spectrum. You have right wing, you have left wing going all the way to the far left, and they all have to find a way to get along and try to keep this government stable. And one of the things that they agreed on, that they decided to do in order to keep the government stable, is to not really make any kind of substantial progress with the Palestinians. And so there won't be any sort of extensions of sovereignty or annexation in Judea and Samaria, but there also won't be negotiations for a two-state solution. That being said, there are things moving on the ground, things that have happened that have not happened in years. Defense Minister Benny Gantz met twice with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. There have been increases in the number of Palestinian workers that can come into Israel, not only from Judea and Samaria, but also from Gaza. And our Foreign Minister Yair Lapid has a plan for Gaza of sort of an economic peace kind of plan, more like if Hamas delegitimizes, then Israel will encourage a lot of investment and make things easier. But the fact that there's this kind of plan coming from a senior figure in the coalition is something. At the same time, there's still construction and plans for construction in Judea and Samaria and in Jerusalem that are being advanced. Of course, for Israel, Jerusalem is part of sovereign Israel, but for basically every single country in the world, East Jerusalem they don't recognize it as part of Israel. The US, well, so this is diving into the US position. So the US recognizes Jerusalem as Israel's capital, but is continuing to criticize Israel for planning to build in different parts of Jerusalem. And so that brings us to the situation of the US. How is the US treating this sort of unique, strange situation in the government where it's not only a static position with the Palestinians, but they're saying that it's static. They want it to be static, and they're saying we can't do it any other way or the government won't be stable. So the big thing for President Biden is settlements, and it has been for decades. There's a very famous Menachem Begin quote that I am not a Jew with trembling knees. He says that we will continue to defend our country and do what we need to do, even if the US threatens us. That's not the exact quote, but that's my paraphrase of it. And that quote, which, is like a meme all over the internet, and it comes from the book, I believe the book, The Prime Minister is by Yehuda Avner. It was actually said in a meeting between Menachem Begin and senators, and it was in response to Biden, then Senator Biden, who was threatening US aid to Israel over the issue of settlements. So the current US president has a very long history of strongly opposing construction and settlements, and this government is no different. I have heard from sources in the US government and in Israel that there's constant messages being sent from the Biden administration to the current prime minister, to stop anytime anything comes up, really. And, we've seen cases already, like the plan to build an Atarot, where there used to be an airport. It's part of Jerusalem. The plan to build a neighborhood there has sort of been put on hold because of pressure from Washington. Now, the other sort of part of this obsession with settlements is that, and obsession is a word that someone in the Prime Minister's office has used speaking to me about this, is also the issue of violence by truly a small minority of settlers, but the incidents make huge headlines. And those headlines then lead to the Biden administration and others as well, the EU, but we're here talking about Biden, coming to Israel and complaining about it. Now, for Israel, for the most part, this is a law enforcement issue, right? The police need to handle it, or the border patrol, because it's in Judea and Samaria. And for the US, it's sort of part of this broader issue of a two-state solution, and will it be possible? And is Israel doing everything to keep it possible? And so there's a lot of pressure and a lot of discussion on that front as well. Another area where there's been some tension between the US and Israel when it comes to the Palestinian issue is Palestinian NGOs. A couple of months ago, Israel outlawed 6 Palestinian NGOs because of their connections to the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a terrorist organization that is designated as such in the US, in Europe, and several other places as well. The Israel sort of security establishment has brought evidence, publicly available evidence, of connections between these organizations, and they've argued that these 6 organizations were serving as conduits, as sort of money laundering apparatuses for the terrorist group. Now, the US pretty strongly criticized that decision, that ban, when it first came out. They claimed that Israel had not updated them, even though Israel said specifically who updated the US and when, and who they spoke to in the US. So we know all those details, and it seems pretty unlikely at this point that all of those details would have come from Jerusalem and not be true. At this point, as of last week, I can say from a US diplomatic source that the situation is that they're still looking into it. But the US, so they're no longer criticizing Israel for it, but they're not willing to come outright and say that Israel was right about it. But the other thing that this same diplomatic source said to me is that, the US has never funded any of these organizations. So they're kind of distancing themselves from that. I think the final issue between Israel and the US on the Palestinian front is the consulate in Jerusalem. The US opened the consulate in Jerusalem about 100 years ago, before there was a state of Israel. And it continued to be open in Jerusalem even after there was a state of Israel, and they opened an official embassy in Tel Aviv. And that was the consulate that served Palestinians. After former President Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital, they closed the consulate. They sort of merged what was the consulate into the embassy, calling it the Palestinian Affairs Unit. And the building was used as the Ambassador Friedman's official residence briefly. For most of the time, he was continuing to live in Herzliya until they sold that house. So now the situation is that Ambassador Knights does not live in that building. He lives in Jerusalem, but not in that building. The Palestinian Affairs Unit is working out of that building, but it is not called a consulate. And they need Israel's permission in order for it to officially be the consulate. Now, this government is not going to give permission. There was a little bit of doubt at the beginning. There was some thought that maybe the center left parts of this coalition might be okay with it. But at this point, Prime Minister Bennett is very, very clear that he opposes it. He thinks it's an issue of Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem, that recognizing the embassy to the Palestinians in Jerusalem would be akin to dividing Jerusalem, or recognizing that the Palestinians have some sort of legitimate claim to Jerusalem. And Lapid doesn't say it in as many words or as strongly as Bennett has, but he basically agrees. He says it's not going to happen. The US has not given up on the consulate. And they say that it's still on the agenda, and they feel that they can still recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital while still opening a consulate. But what it seems like at this point is that the pressure has been reduced a lot. It's not something that they're bringing up a lot because they realize that there's sort of a stalemate here. And so while they're not saying that they've given up on it, they're not really pushing for it at this point. So those are the different sort of points of tension and the different issues on the table between the US, the Biden administration and the Bennett government when it comes to Israel and the Palestinians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lahab. Now we have a few questions. The first one is to Professor Mendelbaum. Are you with us?
I am.
Michael? Okay.
I'm here.
So this is a question for you. Given your framework, excellent framework for analysis, what the United States should do or would do in three scenarios. Number one, Russia attacks the Ukraine, China attacks Taiwan, and Hezbollah attacks Israel.
Well, I think I would distinguish among those three scenarios. The United States does have some derivative responsibility for Ukraine, and the hope is that although the United States will not defend Ukraine, it will give Ukraine military assistance to help the Ukrainians defend themselves against Russia. There's a debate here about what sorts of weapons are appropriate. And the United States will lead the Western community in imposing stiffer sanctions on the Russians. On Taiwan, that's a very, very tough question. The United States is not formally committed to defend Taiwan, but there is an informal commitment. And if the mainland should take over Taiwan, that would be devastating for the American position in East Asia and everywhere as well. So the hope there is that the United States can deter China from attempting a cross-channel assault, and do so in part by helping the Taiwanese upgrade their military capacity. Now, when it comes to the Middle East, my view is that the American responsibility is to deal with the Iranian nuclear weapons threat. Israel can defend itself against Hezbollah and can defend itself against Iranian efforts to surround it by reinforcing its positions in the surrounding countries. And Israel is doing so, and doing so, I think, from as far as I can tell, at least modestly effectively. So I don't think that it falls within the purview of American responsibility actively to defend Israel against Hezbollah. What it does fall within the American purview of responsibility, I think, to do, although I'm not sure that this responsibility is being or will be effectively carried out, is to ensure that Iran does not get nuclear weapons. The gap between the American view and the Israeli view was well stated by General Amidror. I agree there is a gap. I think that that's unfortunate. I wish that the American point of view were closer to the Israeli one, because it seems to me that the most effective way of rolling back the Iranian nuclear weapons program, if it can be done, and it may be too late for that, but the most effective, the only effective way to deal with this problem is to make it clear to the mullahs in charge of Iran that if they proceed, they will suffer severe military damage of the kind that the American Air Force is much better positioned to inflict than the far smaller Israeli Air Force. That conviction on the part of the mullahs that if they proceed, they will lose their program and they might lose their regime due to a serious American attack, which does not involve American boots on the ground, which would be conducted strictly from the air. That, I think, is the appropriate policy. I can't say that it seems to me that it's the one the United States is now conducting.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. Next question to General Amidror. And this is a question: what do you make of the difference in the attitudes of Israeli military intelligence and the Mossad on the return, going back to the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran? General Amidror.
At the end, with all due respect to my friends in both the Mossad and the military intelligence, it is a decision that should be taken by the leaders of Israel and not by the intelligence community. They have the responsibility. They have the ability to think about broader issues than the proper professional details. And as in the past, I preach to seniority and responsibility of the decision makers and not the professionals. The professionals should bring to the table all the details, all the facts, their assessment. It's okay, but at the end of the day, the decision taken.
How were the bumps?
Okay, go ahead.
The decision should be taken by the elected politicians in the state of Israel who are sitting in the government, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the members of the cabinet. This is the system in Israel, and we should not change it. The government and the decision-making should be done by the elected leaders and not by the nominated professionals.
Thank you. Next question to Dr. Lerman. What do you make of Erdogan's proposal for a gas deal with Israel?
As I said, Erdogan has been sobered up to some extent by a combination of factors, the relative failure of his attempts to support the Muslim Brotherhood across the region, the rising difficulties in Washington, and the Turkish economy, which seems to be tanking, to judge by the exchange rate of the Turkish lira. So he's now trying to see if he can patch up his relations, which were very problematic with Saudi Arabia, to see if there can be a negotiated outcome in Libya that would reduce the level of hostility with Egypt, and to court Israel to some extent. He's been nice to President Herzog on the in calling for condolences at the passing of the president's mother. He has used previous opportunities to send such signals. But when it comes to ultimately relying on Turkey as an energy hub or as a conduit for the export of Israeli, Egyptian, and Cypriot gas, we very quickly come up against the Cypriot question. And unless and until there's a solution to the Cypriot question, there are geopolitical and physical difficulties. After all, we're not going to run a pipeline through the Lebanese or Syrian EEZs. So the only way would be to do this via Cyprus, and of course this immediately collapses the notion of an Israeli-Turkish pipeline. Beyond that, I think it is appropriate for Israel to stand firmly with the newly found partners of the alignment, which has now survived several political changes in Greece, a political change in Israel. The only persistent participant has been Nikos Anastasiadis in Cyprus. But it tells us that this is across the political aisle in both in Athens and in Jerusalem. This is a matter of growing importance for us, for our future. And I think we should be very, very wary of Turkish siren songs, even if there are some very good reasons for Erdogan to try and improve relations.
Okay, thank you very much. And this is a question to Lahab Kharkov. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that the Biden administration does not have any desire to come up with a new peace proposal for Israelis and Palestinians. But what do you think would be the case, say, a year from now, after the midterm elections? Would the United States come up with a new peace plan or peace initiative, or at least a platform or a way to, in case of violence eruption, with something that that would be needed to revive the peace process?
I think that a lot depends on what happens in Israel. I think as long as Bennett is prime minister, you know, and he's not supposed to be prime minister for that long, I think that they're just going to sort of keep things chugging along and not try to threaten, you know, or destabilize the current Israeli government. I think that if this government runs its course and there's the rotation and Yair Lapid becomes prime minister, then that's the point where the Biden administration may feel like they really have someone to work with and they might start pushing harder. That being said, and I mean, it's a lot to go into right now, there are certain political developments, or one could call them legal developments because they're relating to former Prime Minister Netanyahu's legal situation, that I think could really shake things up in Israel. And who knows if we're going to have this rotation and Lapid will be prime minister, or maybe we'll have an election this year already. I suppose that's an open question at all times in Israel, regardless of you know, Netanyahu's plea bargain or not. But that's the reason people are talking about it right now, because of the plea bargain. Yeah, I think, and as far as if another round of violence with Hamas will lead them to have some sort of, well, I guess you didn't say Hamas, you said generally. If there's violence with Hamas, I don't think that would push anyone towards pushing for a two-state solution, because Hamas is sort of, they're Palestinians, but they're a different problem, and nobody thinks that the two-state solution is going to be negotiated with them. If the several cases of terrorism in the past couple months turn into a real big wave of terror coming from Judea and Samaria, then I think that there may be bigger involvement with the Biden administration, because or at least the Biden administration feels that there's someone to talk to there. They are in touch with the Palestinian Authority and with President Abbas. That being said, they really are not pushing for negotiations or talking about a peace plan or anything like that. They just don't want steps on the ground that they feel would make a two-state solution impossible when that eventuality comes.
Okay, thank you very much. Our time is up. I would like to thank all of our speakers, for their excellent presentations and lively discussion. Efraim, I am transferring the virtual gavel to you. Efraim? Where is Efraim? Okay, we have to conclude. Efraim? We have to conclude this conference.
Okay, I'm okay now. I'm okay. I unmuted myself for some time, and I resisted my temptations to intervene. So I want to thank everybody for their participation. I want to thank our audience for being able to sit so much time in front of a screen. And I hope we'll meet again at another JISS event in the near future. All the best to everybody from Jerusalem. Maybe it will snow tonight. This will be an attraction. Okay, good night.
Thank you and good night.
Good night. Thank you very much.